Hello, my friends. It's Stacy of Stacy Creates Stuff, and I am here at work today. And while there are no customers, I thought I would get started cutting my next quilt. If you are new here, my name is Stacy, and I am a quilter, knitter, embroiderer. I like to do all the crafts, especially if they involve fabric or fiber. And if you have joined me before, welcome back. Today I am going to be making a pink quilt just in time to celebrate Breast Cancer Awareness Month. So let's get started. I'm going to start by preparing the background fabric. So I have a 2-yard piece. And usually when I cut strips, they are typically cut however wide by the width of the fabric, which is typically anywhere from about 40 to 44 inches. It just depends on how the fabric is printed. However, with this particular quilt, I have some very long strips, and I am going to be cutting them along the selvage way so that I get a nice long strip that I need. So I am going to make sure that all of my selvage edges are aligned up. And I'm going to start by cutting off the selvage. And actually, let's go ahead and open this up the full width. This is a fun little polka dot. That is just going to be perfect. It's a light creamy white background with light pink polka dots on them. All right, so there's my whole width of the fabric. But I am going to be cutting along the selvage. So first off will be to cut off that selvage. So I'm going to go ahead and align my ruler along the fold there, and then, oh, not too bad. I want to make sure that, because there's one more fold down here, that is also aligning with a line on the ruler, or at least parallel to a line. And I'm going to go ahead, slice off that selvage. All right, that gives me a nice straight line to start cutting. So let's check and see what we need to cut first. All right, I'm going to be cutting 7 2.5-inch strips. And these are going to be my sashing strips. Now, the instructions that I've written do have how long they need to be. However, I am going to wait to trim them down until after I have sewn the ribbon blocks together. All right, I have all 7 of my sashing strips, so I'm going to go ahead and set those aside for now. Gotta get them all neatly stacked. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and shake out my fabric and get ready to cut the next set of strips. And since it may have shifted a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and retrim that line. Retrim that edge. And my next set is to cut 3 3.5-inch strips. Now these are going to get further subcut into various lengths that will be used within the ribbon blocks themselves. Set those aside for a moment. And I'm going to go ahead and cut up the rest of this fabric, and then I'll come back and subcut these. From this remaining fabric, I need 72 3.5-inch squares. Let's start by cutting some strips. More selvage, just throw this away. Unless you're a crumb quilter, then you can keep it. But I have cut 4 more 3.5-inch strips, and these I'm going to subcut into 72 3.5-inch squares. Whew. Now I know that cutting is often part of quilting that a lot of quilters don't love. I recently did a poll in my community tab here on YouTube and questioned what was your least favorite aspect of quilting. And the quilting binding and cutting fabric way outshined any other aspect of quilting as the least favorite. So I have found that if I cut all of my pieces ahead of time, that saves a lot of stress. Through the magic of video, I managed to cut out my 72 3.5-inch squares, and I'm going to go ahead and set those aside. I now need to subcut these 3.5-inch strips. And remember, these were cut along that selvage piece of a 2-yard piece. So I'm working with 72 inches as opposed to 42, 44. And I'm going to take one strip, and the first piece that I'm going to cut is 30.5 inches long. Yes, 30.5 inches long. Now, I don't typically use my mat as a ruler for measuring things to cut, so I am going to use it because I otherwise don't have a ruler that is long enough. Ooh, actually, I do. The shop has a ruler that is long enough, so let me go ahead and use that. So I'm going to set that one aside. From the remaining part of that strip, I'm going to cut one piece that is 24.5 inches long. I think I'm going to have to get myself one of these really long rulers. This is fabulous. Looks like I have enough strip left. Let's see if I can cut and go back to my regular ruler here. I need a piece that is 18.5 inches, and I'm going to get that. So cut that. I'll take another strip, and I'm going to continue cutting some more 18.5-inch lengths. I need a total of 3. So I have the one. Let's cut 2 more. I have my strip doubled over because make those cuts work for you. If with one cut I can be making 2 pieces, all the better. All right, I'm going to set those aside, and I need one 12.5-inch piece. Oh, and then I'm going to need 4 more. So let me see how many 12.5-inch pieces I can get from this strip. This piece isn't long enough for 12.5, but I also need some 6.5-inch pieces. So I'll go ahead and cut one of those. So far we have 2 12.5-inch pieces. We need a total of 5. So with my last strip here doubled over, I'm going to go ahead, square up the end. This one's a little raggedy. All right, there's those 2. I need one more, so I'm going to unfold my strip, cut that last one. That's the 5th one. Looks good. I need one more 6.5-inch piece. Great. All right, I'm just going to save this piece for something. And I have all of my long strips here. These are for the ribbon blocks, and I am just going to go ahead and stack them all on top of each other so that I can pack them away. And now let's talk about our fabrics. So I've separated out the darker pieces from the lighter pieces, and you need to decide which order you want to put the pink ribbons in. So I have decided on this order, and I think that's a nice balance of the darker, not the darkest, but the darker of this set, kind of spaced apart. We have a lighter one, and we have 3 medium ones based on these. These are the lighter of the pinks. And this is important to make note of because the pieces that I cut for the ribbons are different for each color. So this is going to be pink A, pink B, pink C, D, E, and F. And in the kit with the pattern, you will get a sheet that you can cut apart and mark which one of these is which. So that will be important for knowing what you need to do. It's much easier with the darker set. So we're going to actually start with those. So I have layered all of my darks here. Just stack them on top of each other. And I'm going to go ahead and cut off the selvage. There's a total of 6 fabrics. This part is super easy because you just need 6.5-inch squares. Let's make sure I got the selvage on all of these. Some of these had pretty wide selvages. Yep, we're good. I went and grabbed the wider ruler so that I can easily cut that 6.5-inch square. So having cut off the selvage, I'm just going to go ahead and cut a 6.5-inch piece. Always double check that you're cutting the right width. Now, some ribbons will require 2 squares and some will require 3. I'm going to make it really easy on myself and just cut 3 squares for everything. Because, well, if you've seen my channel before, you know that I like to do fun things on the back of my quilt. And so these extra squares will definitely come in handy. I'm going to just set that stack aside, cut another 6.5-inch piece. And then one more. This just saves me the aggravation of going back and forth of now which one needed 2 and which one needed 3. I'll have 3 for all of them, and then I can just pull what I need when I'm ready to sew those together. Now, certainly you could go ahead and figure out which one goes with which. It's all written in the instructions, whether it's ribbon A or B, C, D, E, or F, and you can go from there. But I said, I just like to keep things simple in my mind, and if I just make an extra square, so be it. All right, I'm going to go ahead for each of these piles, trim the edge. Make sure I've gotten them all. Yep. And then again, cut a 6.5-inch width, so I'll have my square. Any excess I'm just setting aside. Again, I like to do fun things on the backs of my quilts. And it will be easy to incorporate some of these fun pinks there as well. And one last pile. And then our darker pinks will be all situated. All right, I'm going to set those aside, and then let's talk about these lighter pinks. Now, I had a customer earlier, so I had to shut off my camera, and while I was doing that, I went ahead and cut the pieces that I needed for part of the ribbon block. So each fabric for the lighter pinks is going to require 3.5-inch strip, and then either 3 or 4, it just depends on the ribbon, 6.5-inch squares. So I've already cut my ribbon piece. I'm going to check to see what this first pink, pink A, requires. And I will go ahead and cut my 6.5-inch squares from the piece I have left. So the instructions will go ahead and tell you what exactly you need to cut for each color because it is different for each ribbon. I am back in my studio and I have all of my pieces cut. So we have those long 2.5-inch strips that are for sashing. And I'm just going to set those aside. We won't need those until we start actually constructing the quilt. I have my 3.5-inch squares, so many of them. I have my 3.5-inch strips of various lengths according to the instructions. I have my 6.5-inch squares of the darker pinks. I have 6.5-inch squares of the lighter pinks. And I have my 3.5-inch strips subcut into various lengths, including some 3.5-inch squares of all my ribbon colors. And I've laid them out in the order that I am calling them. So this is pink A, B, C, D, E, and F. So what is the first thing that we are going to construct? Well, set these aside for a moment. The easiest thing will be to pair up my long ribbon strips with the equal length of background strip. So I'm going to be sewing those two pieces together and pressing towards the pink. Let's start there. Here are all the bands all those strips that I sewed together. Those are the 3.5-inch strips. And I know it's really hard on my very light design wall to see that there is light fabric, but indeed there is. And I've just roughly laid these out. There's a lot of blocks that go in between each stripe. So we'll see that once we have the other blocks done. So let me show you how to put those squares together. Now it's time to tackle our large squares. So all of the lighter pink squares are going to get 2 of the background squares sewn to each corner. Well, just 2 of the corners, not each corner. So I'll take one of my light pink squares. I'm going to place a background square on 2 opposite corners. And then I'm going to draw a line from corner to corner so that when these are sewn, it will go back like this. I'm going to use my grip board here. It has a piece of sandpaper. Let's do this one. It's a little bit better without having fabric underneath it because the whole purpose of the sandpaper is to keep the fabric from moving. So there we have that. I'm just aligning the outside edges of each square, small square to the large square, and then I will sew just inside this line, inside being towards the part that's going to ultimately be cut away. I will press that back. I'll probably be pressing the seams towards the pink since the background is so light. And I'm going to go ahead and trim off the excess fabric. So I'm going to do that for all of the light squares. Now the dark squares are going to have the same thing. They're going to have 2 of the light background. They're going to have 2 of the background. So I will sew those into place, trim and press those. And then they are, in addition, going to have their corresponding light color go into the opposite corners. And I would sew like that, so that essentially you get a sort of a snowball type of block there. But you want to do opposite corners first and then the others. Does it really matter whether you start with the background squares or the corresponding light pink squares? No. Do whichever you prefer. So let's get all those together And then we can start laying out our quilt. All right, I have sewn the two types of squares. So the lighter pink big squares, just got the background squares put on opposite corners for those. And just to show you what that looks like, it looked like this, and then these would get cut off. Now, you may notice that I have 2 lines of stitching here, and that is because since this is a fairly decent sized chunk of fabric that I'll be cutting away, it also makes a great half square triangle. Right, there you go. So why not go ahead and just sew about half an inch, mine's probably a little less, more like 3/8 of an inch away from the line. So you want to be accurate with this line. That's the line that's for the actual block. And then I just kind of guesstimate, because I'll be trimming these down to a uniform size amongst them all later. That's a whole separate video on what to do with leftover half square triangles. Anyhow, I wanted to show you that. And yes, I do sew those lines before I cut them apart. And then of course I can take my rotary cutter and I just place it between the 2 lines, making sure I'm not going to cut either line, and separate that off. And of course I do that to the other side. So that is for all of the light pink squares. Now the dark pink squares have not only background fabrics, again at opposite corners, but they also have the light pink squares done in the other opposite corners. So a little evolution of what that looked like. After I sewed on the background squares, I did the same thing. I sewed on the lighter pink squares that coordinated with that fabric. Remember, I used 2 fabrics from the same line, one lighter, one darker. So those were the light pink squares. And I did the same thing. I sewed 2 parallel lines. Again, this one needs to be very accurate so that this block is accurate. And this one I just guesstimated, 3/8 to half an inch away. And then I will cut these apart as well. Same thing, you just want to make sure you're not going to be cutting through either of those sewing lines. And then of course when you open it up, it looks like this. Now that we have all of these blocks, we've already done our long strips, it is time to lay out the quilt. So I have moved the strips of pink way up to the top so that I can fit the whole ribbon mostly down the sides. And I went ahead and I sewed the first one because I was so anxious to see what it looked like. I think it turned out great. And then I have placed the second one. So now I'm going to go ahead and place the other pieces. So I have all of the blocks. I have both the light pink blocks and the dark pink blocks. I'm basing that on what the center part of the block is. And it's really easy. So I just see I need the polka dot ones next. And after the ribbon coming down, then you will need a light pink block, and it simply goes like that. Makes sense that you want the ribbon to keep sweeping around, and then you just kind of keep matching things up. So then I have the light pink corner, comes down to that. It's time for another light pink block. And you just continue on in that manner until you have all of the ribbons completed. And every ribbon is a little bit different. And you'll remember that in the instructions, some of them said you needed 2 or 3 of the dark squares and 3 or 4 of the light squares. And that just depends on how many twists there are in the ribbon. And of course, once you determine which pink is in which order, then you can determine how many squares you need. So that's why the instructions are a little vague at that point until you've decided which pink goes where, or which color if you're doing a different color set of ribbons. So let me go ahead and place all the rest of these, and then I'll just mention a few other things before I start sewing it together. All right, so one of the great things about this quilt is that each ribbon is its own row, and it doesn't have to match up to any seams in another ribbon row because there is sashing that goes in between. There's those thin strips of background fabric that we cut early on. Other great thing about this quilt is that when you were sewing your pieces together, they for some reason didn't come out, either I cut one incorrectly or whatnot, it's fine, because in the end, after I've sewn all the strips together, I'll go ahead and even that up, or at least I'll flip it around. No, I won't flip it around. I will just even that up before I sew this on. Once I have all the strips sewn together and pressed, then I'm going to figure out which is the shortest strip, because they might be off by just a little bit. And then I will trim all of the strips to be that same length. And then I will make sure that all my sashing strips are equal to that length as well. Sew the whole thing together and it'll be a quilt. Let's see how it turned out. All right, my friends, that concludes this tutorial for the Pink Ribbons quilt. This project is beginner friendly. It just involved strips and squares, a little bit of sewing, and voila, you have a quilt. The kit for this quilt is available exclusively from my favorite quilt shop, Vintage Pink and Green. I will put a link in the description below, and during the month of October 2024, a portion of the proceeds from the sale of this kit will go to our local Women Supporting Women group here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland that really helps to support women who are going through breast cancer. Until next time, my friends, keep quilting, keep stitching, and I will see you soon.